New York's infamous Blue Note era comes to Mars Hill January 24th for a special one-night-only concert at Mars Landing Galleries. Civil Disobedience is a project bowing to the politically conscious underground jazz of 1960s New York City. You'll hear music from progressive composers such as Bobby Hutcherson, Jackie McLean, Stanley Cowell, Howard Land, Joe Chambers, and James Spaulding. Much of their music wasn't released on record till decades later, and you can hear New York musicians performing it live January 24th. Seating is intimate and limited. For tickets and details, go to marslandinggalleries.com. In 2018, I produced separate feature stories for Blue Ridge Public Radio on violinist Andrew Finn Magill and horror novelist and playwright Jamieson Ridenhour. Both have made creative leaps since then. Magill has an eclectic, genre-crossing new album called The Polaris Project.
Something about that session, there was just like so much excitement, so much creative energy specifically in the room. It left me thinking about my music in a whole new way. So I've approached composition differently.
We'll get into Magill's story in the second half of this episode. First, we sit with Jamieson Ridenhour, the writer and co-creator of Palimpsest, a horror podcast with a wide and devoted fan base.
I've never had this with other work. We get fan emails and people doing fan art and people having theories about this is what I think is going on. Am I near the mark? Is this a clue that you've put in here? Which is a blast.
Ridenhour and the co-creator of Palimpsest, actress Hayley Heninger, celebrate the upcoming 5th season of their show with a performance October 26 at the Black Mountain Center for the Arts. Magill launches his album with an October 27th concert at the Wortham Center for the Performing Arts in Asheville. I'm Matt Peiken, and this is The Overlook, a podcast about the news, arts, issues, and trends of Asheville, North Carolina. Today, a shared episode with Andrew Finn Magill and Jamieson Ridenhour. Jamieson Ridenhour has written a handful of horror plays, films, and pieces of short fiction, and he teaches writing at Warren Wilson College. Nothing has caught on with the public quite like Palimpsest, which Ridenhour says has totaled about 750,000 downloads since its debut 5 years ago. Here's a segment of an episode recorded in 2022, featuring the voice of actress and co-creator Hayley Heninger.
You should probably sit down, I said. Belladonna makes a lovely tea, but it is hard on the system the first time. She swayed on her feet, confusion knotting her brow. Sometimes the belladonna causes hallucinations, and the tea was pretty concentrated. Who knows what she was seeing just then? It took a moment for her to follow what I had just said, her wide eyes moving from me to the cup and back. "You little bitch," she said, the most honest she had been all day. She turned and stumbled toward the door, and at the same time I stood up and let the big kitchen knife drop from my sleeve into my hand. I'll admit, I was impressed by her strength. Even with the tea, she made it into the foyer. She might have made it as far as the porch, but you'll be happy to hear I was faster.
I began my conversation with Ridenhour by asking what inspired him to steer his writing into audio drama and podcasting.
At the time, in 2017, I was listening to and just getting turned on to some emerging audio dramas, and particularly one called Alice Isn't Dead, made by the people that do Welcome to Night Vale. And Alice Isn't Dead was, Joseph Fink writes it, and there was a single actress that performed it. And I just thought it'd be fun to try. I thought it felt like something I could do. I had some recording equipment. My son's a musician. I felt like, what if I try this and see how it works? And then Hayley was interested too, so we gave it a shot. And one of the things I'm fascinated with in my writing is the use of the unreliable narrator in lots of different ways. Sometimes they're devious, sometimes they're just clueless, sometimes just we know more than they do. And a single voice seemed to be the perfect vehicle to do that. We have a character telling us this story, and particularly in our first season, about midway through, you're like, I'm not really sure she's telling me everything that she knows, or maybe things aren't quite what she understands. And that's, for me, that's a real hook of a story. And I really enjoyed being able to explore it that way.
That's really surprising to me, because when you're writing in theater or writing a novel, you have infinite characters from which to draw from. You can pull in different settings and, tell from a variety of perspectives. I would think once you've already had that experience, and to the depth that you had, that you would find a single narrator in some ways maybe a challenge, but limiting too. Why did you find that appealing to tell a story from that vantage? Your episodes run, 20, 30 minutes?
Yeah, about 20 minutes.
Yeah, so that's a long time for a singular voice to be talking.
Yeah, it
and
is.
I think it's a challenge to hold an audience's attention for that span of time. So what was it about that form that really appealed to you?
Part of it is the challenge. Like when I write poetry, for instance, I like writing in form, which a lot of modern poets don't, but I like writing sonnets or sestinas or something I like having parameters that force me to then be more creative. I can't just do anything I want with a first-person single narrator. So I have to then force myself to be more creative. If I want to present this information, how do I do it if she wasn't in the room? At the end of most seasons, we have at least one episode where we have other actors, and usually that's because the storytelling format needs to be broken out of somehow. She's clearly not going to survive this, so how do I tell the end of the story? I've got to bring somebody else in. But for the most part, I just like the challenge. I think it forces me to be more creative. The last thing we've done, we had in 2022, we didn't do a season. We did 5 standalone episodes, which each were set in a different time and place in the house. And one of those episodes was our 5th anniversary episode, and it was called The Junior Satan Club, about a group of high school goths who break into the house. And we had 4 other actors in that. There were 5 voices in that, and we performed that live at the Magnetic with all of those actors.
How did you have to augment your sense of voice when you're having a single narrator who's not just telling, in this case, her own story, but others around her? Tell me about imbuing voice into your characters when they're not voiced by themselves.
That's a great question. So often that has to do with the framing narrative that I've put it into. For instance, season 1 is a woman who is giving audio notes to her therapist who has moved away. So she is literally narrating the story. We try and conceive it so that she's not just like reading a story to the audience. We're listening to these audio tapes. We're listening to transcripts of letters.
And I will say that is a vehicle I've seen a number of fictional podcasts use initially, is like a notes to somebody else. Yep. I'm writing this to somebody else. It's a very convenient vehicle, but you did move away from that. So talk about that and how that was a stepping stone for you into other ways of framing the single voice.
I think all of it has to do with, goes back to the idea of the unreliable narrator and goes back to the mutability of memory, which is one of our themes. So the idea that I'm telling you things that have happened to me, but I am consciously or unconsciously rewriting them in my head, either to make myself look better or to elide certain things. And like season 2 is a confessional. She's confessing to a priest who you realize later on is dead, actually. And so she's talking to a dead priest, which for me is
spoiler
just
alert.
Fun. It is a spoiler alert, but that was 4 years ago. You guys should be caught up. It should be pretty evident pretty quick that the dude is dead. But I liked that idea of like, here's a confessional. You're supposed to be laying everything bare, everything truthful in all of your sins. And the fact that she is lying to herself about a lot of what she's saying adds a layer of kind of dramatic irony that I enjoy.
How do you pace out a season? There's 10 episodes, and I would think in some sense as a writer, you would welcome that structure, that you've got 10 chapters to fill, there has to be a progression. But when you, again, have this single, unreliable narrator, is it different plotting a course of a story that way as opposed to through a theatrical play or a novel?
It's definitely different than a play. It feels more like a short novel. Each one of our seasons ends up being around 25,000 words.
So that is like novella length or almost novel.
Yeah,
in
it's
between.
about half a novel, yeah.
That's a lot. Now, length aside, is it a different approach for each piece of it? How do you approach short form? Well, that's not really short form writing, even in a novel sense, in a fiction sense. How do you approach the very beginning of a season for Palimpsest?
It's not short form writing, but it is episodic writing, and that's something I had to learn. And our first season was a huge learning curve for both of us. And what I learned as a writer was pacing, because we have a 10-episode arc, and we know generally the outline of the story going in. I might not know the actual ending, but when I begin writing, I know the shape of the story. And then, so I've got that story that's going to be 10 episodes long. Each individual episode has to advance that main story, but it also has, if you're writing for TV, it also has to have a sort of mini climax, or at least natural stopping point that's going to make people want to move to the next one. And so learning those beats took me a minute. What I found was when I went back to writing other kinds of things after doing a couple of seasons of Palimpsest, when I wrote another play, for instance, I had learned so much about pacing that I felt like my other genre writing improved.
You learned so much about pacing through Palimpsest.
Through writing Palimpsest,
That's interesting, but it's a different kind of pacing, isn't it?
It is, but it's when you have, like if I'm writing a play or a novel, and it's a big thing, and I tended before to think about it in terms of chapters or sections or acts, and writing for audio has taught me to think about it in terms of like narrative beats instead of like where, how long have we been going? When is the curtain going to fall for Act 2? More about where are the small points where the story pivots to move us towards a climax.
Now, you said you and Hayley co-create this.
Yes.
So that wasn't that way from the very beginning, or was it?
It was from the very beginning.
So how do you do it? Because you were the writer. When you first met, she was a performer in
Yep.
one of your plays. She didn't write that show. How did you co-write this?
So co-creator is the better phrase than co-write. So what happens is we together come up with the concept of the character.
And it's always, I want to be clear here, we're entering season 5. You've done 4 seasons where there are 4 distinct different stories with 4 different characters.
Yep.
Each piece has its own conclusion and doesn't carry over to the next.
Right. You could pick up any season and start at any point. They all take place in the same house. So our model for that was like American Horror Story. So each season's a new story with a new character, but the same actor. And there are, by this point, 5 seasons in, there are Easter eggs and callbacks to other seasons, but you don't have to know the whole story.
So you say you're co-creators versus co-writers.
Yep.
So talk about your process and talking with Hayley from the beginning about what are you going to create for a new season?
So we'll come together and I'll have a vague idea of like season 5 that we're about to drop. The first episode on Halloween is informed by fairy tales, and it's set in the 1920s in France. And so there's some great Gatsby feel. And I had the idea that I wanted that kind of flavor. So then together we invent the character. Who is the woman that's going to be telling this story? What is her background? What is her situation? And before I even began writing, there was a lot of back and forth where she has a lot of input into who this woman is and how she speaks and how she thinks. And then once I have the character, a real sense of who that person is, I begin writing.
Does Hayley, when you're writing, do you talk with her during your process to help give voice, to shape voice, so
Yep.
so you can imbue your script with that voice?
Yeah. Yes, and we give I send drafts of everything to her. She gives feedback, and there's often a lot of things that happen in the actual recording session where we get in and we're actually hearing it out loud, and she says, this is not the way I would say it. This feels awkward to me, and so there's rewrites there. But also just in terms of, we're 6 years in now, and we've worked together so long, I have a sense of what her voice is going to do. So there's a lot less rewriting at this point because I can hear what she's going to be doing with it as I write it because I know her. As
the series has gone on, has she expanded her range in terms of voice, and how have you used that as a writer?
I like to try and push her and expand her range. She's got a really broad range anyway. I feel very lucky. Hayley's one of the best actors I've ever known, and she can do pretty much anything I hand to her. But I try not to do things like you need to do a French accent for the whole season. I wouldn't do that to her. But season 2, for instance, was a character who was the child of Irish immigrants in the 19th century. And so we did do a lot of, it's sort of an immigrant accent. It's not quite Irish, but it's not quite American. And we did a lot of work to develop that together. And we do consciously try to make characters that are, how could this character be different than the ones we've had before? That we don't want the same flavor every season.
Now, this took off from season 1. Tell me about the kind of response you got and how different that was for you compared to other works you'd done, and what you attribute that to.
Season 1 took off after it was completed. So while we were releasing the episodes of season 1, we had really low download numbers. Like my mom listened.
Really? As season 1, as you were unfurling each episode by episode by episode?
It was growing a little bit, but it wasn't doing big numbers. Then when it was complete, we felt really good about it. We felt like it was the strongest work that we had each done as artists. And I sent the season, like links to the season, along with the press release to a bunch of media venues across the country. And
media outlets that focus on horror?
Yeah, focus on podcasts, focus on audio drama. Yeah.
Okay.
And some on horror in particular, but in 2017 they were beginning to have a lot of coverage of audio drama, or more coverage. And so we got 2 really good national reviews, one in Discover Pods and one in Audio Dramatic, that really praised us, and our numbers started going up then. And then right after those reviews came out, we released season 2, and season 2 jumped.
So the timing just worked out really well.
Yeah, it worked out really well.
Isn't it funny how just the right speck of attention can change things?
Yeah.
It's maddening,
yeah,
because it's just like in any popular art form. You can be a band or a musician that's toiling in obscurity forever, and some song gets picked up for a commercial or gets linked in somehow by somebody who's well known, and
then you're an instant success, right?
Yeah, right. But you've been at this writing game for a long time.
I've been in it for a long time, and when I publish something, I've got to make sure it gets to people. If it's in print, it's got to be distributed. You have all these things that stop you, and audio drama, once you hit upload, it goes everywhere immediately, Spotify and every podcatcher.
So what did that immediacy, the immediacy of this medium, do for you and your interaction with your audience?
On social media in particular, we found a really strong audience responding to us, and I'm really grateful that we have a fairly large queer following and supporting, partially because season 2 features a queer love story, I think, in the center of it, and that was the season where we got some attention and people started listening. But what it means is we get, and I've never had this with other work, we get fan emails and people doing fan art and people having theories about, this is what I think is going on. Am I near the mark? Is this a clue that you've put in here? Which is a blast. It's just really fun.
When you have that happening, does that play back or reverberate back when you're in the creative process in terms of expectations of audiences? Are they really hooked into this thing? Do we propel that now, or do we play on that to any degree in this next story?
It hasn't really played into the creative process as far as the types of stories that we tell. It does play into, if we go particularly long between seasons, I begin to feel a little bit of pressure because I know people are waiting for it. We took about 7 months between this last series of standalones we did in 22 and this new season, just because it's just the 2 of us and sometimes our lives mean that we don't have time to work on it. And we began getting emails. And when are you going to drop a new episode? What's going on? Is everybody okay? And you begin to feel a little bit of, not overwhelming, but I did feel like we probably should get this going.
You mentioned types of stories. Has that evolved? The kinds of stories you and Hayley want to tell, are they different now? Are they more sophisticated, or is there a nuance or subtlety now that you're going for that you wouldn't have necessarily thought so in season 1?
What I didn't know we were going to be able to do when I started. Season 1, we didn't know was going to be season 1. We thought we're going to make this 10-episode thing. And it was a classic ghost story, which I love to write. I've always wanted to write like an M.R. James style unreliable narrator story, and that's what we did. But once we came up with the idea that the house itself, Hawthorne House, where all these events happen, for reasons we have not yet revealed on the show, can appear in different places and times. like a haunted TARDIS. Once I had that idea, then we were free and we could write anything we wanted. So season 3 is set in London during the Blitz in World War II. Season 2 is in a 19th century freak show. Season 3 is set in the early 1990s and has this great sort of Counting Crows soundtrack. And we're going to be in France in the 1920s for season 5. This new season is very grounded in fairy tales. It's about relationships and toxic masculinity and bad marriages and werewolves. And it's probably the most fantastical thing that we've done, and we've done some pretty fantastical things. I can write any kind of story that I want, and as long as we set it in the house, it's Palimpsest.
After the break, my conversation with Andrew Finn Magill. More after this. The First Look newsletter brings you news headlines from all over Asheville every weekday morning. You can scan it at a glance and see if there's something you've missed or just need to know more about. There are no ads disguised as stories, just the headlines in a quick, easy read. Get the First Look newsletter for free at podavl, that's podavl.com/newsletter. Violinist Andrew Finn Magill built his reputation first by exploring the connections of Irish, Scottish, and American fiddle traditions. He moved to Brazil for a while to work with musicians there and compose and record music informed by Brazilian sounds and culture. During the pandemic, Magill dove into writing music for film. I began our conversation by asking what inspired him several years ago to explore beyond Irish fiddle music.
I really started exposing myself to other kinds of music at the Swannanoa Gathering because they teach more than just Irish music there. There's 7 programs spaced over 5 weeks, offering everything from Appalachian Old Time to swing. So I took classes in all that stuff as a kid. I started with Irish music. That's what I fell in love with first, but soon thereafter fell in love with American music of all types, old-time bluegrass, jazz. And I would say even then I was composing music inspired by those styles. But I always tried to compose music like within that style. If I was going to write an Irish tune, it was an Irish tune and not like an Irish bluegrassy hybrid. It's just in the last few years that I decided to start melding them, I suppose you could say.
Were you trying to just expand your vocabulary, or were you looking to express yourself in those idioms?
Probably a bit of both, Matt. Composing historically for me has often been an exercise to see how well do I understand the music that I'm learning. And I always wanted to be able to reproduce within that style, be it Irish or bluegrass or whatever. And it wasn't until I went to Brazil in 2014 and I started composing Brazilian music, choro, or at least I thought I was, that my Brazilian bandmates were like, no, you need to put your own voice into that. Like, we've been hearing Brazilian music our whole lives. We want to hear like a gringo's take on this. And I'd never heard that before, and it was kind of the confidence that I needed perhaps to be able to push some boundaries compositionally, you could say.
How did that affect the music you were making itself? What were you expressing through Irish music that you found was evolving by expressing through a Brazilian lens?
Wow, that's an interesting question. So when I was composing Irish music, one of my biggest heroes was Liz Carroll, still is. And she's not the only, but she's such a prolific composer. I was always amazed at how she was able to compose within the style and have a singular voice. Like, you hear a tune, a Liz tune, and you know it's Liz. And I wanted to be able to do that too. And I wanted to be able to do that in every genre that I composed in. But inevitably, we have our own voices, and even in Brazilian music, as much as I tried to stifle it, I suppose at the beginning, my voice came through, and The band that I played in, it was called Ufino, Brazilian Choro Quartet. They really liked that. And it wasn't a conscious decision at first, but once I realized that, okay, like my voice isn't going anywhere, it's going to be in my tunes, I decided to embrace it a little bit more and be a little more deliberate about blending. I don't know if it was necessarily Irish music with Brazilian music, but some of my other influences like jazz and American music.
The new record, it seems to me, while the one when I first met you back in 2018 was much more grounded in Brazilian music, you're kind of all over the map here with this music. There's even kind of traces of hip hop to it.
Yeah.
Talk about this new record and what you were looking for in these songs. Tell me about the path of composing these songs that became the record.
Sure. So this is a total tangent, but in the last 2 years I've started to score for film. And so that's how that interest has emerged.
Were these projects that you're being commissioned for?
Some of them, yeah.
How did that happen? How did people even know to find you to commission scores from you?
One was a fan. This is just an amazing coincidence because she didn't even know that I was necessarily scoring for film. But most of them have been through my friends in the film world. And during the pandemic, there were no gigs. You couldn't tour. So I was, what's something I could do from home? I'm like, oh, yeah, I've always liked film music, and that would be cool. And so I've only done like 7 projects.
That's a pretty good clip. And so talk about the process, and we're getting away from your record here. We'll get back to it. So talk about your process of writing for films. Are you still writing from violin first, or are you starting on a keyboard or starting with rhythms or moods? Where's your starting point, and what are the building blocks?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it changes a lot for every film. I write almost everything on a keyboard, on a MIDI keyboard, but each film has been so different sonically that I've had to really study up on that form of music, and sometimes there's no violin whatsoever. So I'm not thinking as much as a violinist, and I guess I am thinking in moods. At the end of the day, it's all about the director, what the director wants. It's their vision. So
you said you start writing on a MIDI keyboard. Do you do that with your own music as well, or does that start with violin?
So maybe to get to transition to the record here, it didn't historically, but now that I've discovered the keyboard and how great it is to be able to write with MIDI. So for the Polaris Project, I made scratch tracks for every single tune, and I recorded it all with the violin or violins. And so I'd be like playing the bass line with my octave violin, for the scratch track, or I'd be playing like the keyboard chords with my violin, like a stack of double stops.
You would just be layering them.
I'd just be layering them, and it was tedious, and at the end of the day, a little limiting too, because I don't have all the notes that a bass has, even on an octave violin, or there's just sounds like one of the things that was really inspiring about working with these musicians was how they heard.
What instrumentation did you bring in, and were you all recording live together?
It was all recorded live. Yeah, we recorded it at Echo Mountain in Asheville, which is just a playground of instruments. It's like a musician's fantasy land. So recording it there really affected which instruments we used, and then ultimately which moods and vibes were created, because I had heard things a certain way, but then once we got in there, I'm thinking of Justin, our keys player, specifically, because they have so many keyboards at Echo Mountain. So on this album, there's a Wurlitzer and Hammond B3 organ and clavinet and piano and Rhodes and multiple Moog synthesizers and all this stuff at our fingertips. So the last time we chatted, it was about Canta Violino, my Brazilian album. And maybe I'll explain a little bit the origins of the Polaris Project through this. Canta Violino was very much a Brazilian album in the same way that my album Roots was very much an Irish album. And historically, just like I composed as a kid, my albums have been very much in the genre that, that project is about, be it Irish music or Brazilian or whatever. And with the Polaris Project, I decided to start mixing them deliberately and not be as committed to a genre per se, but just write the music that's most me, and whatever happens, happens.
With the new record, you were deliberately looking to bridge styles and across styles. Talk about specific songs. Name a song that stretched the bounds for you as a composer and that illustrates new territory for you and how you approached it.
Sure. Probably Idols, which is the single. That was the last piece I composed for the project, and I actually composed it specifically for these musicians. Over the past few years, I've been really inspired by some of these modern instrumental groups, bands like Snarky Puppy and Progger and Funky Knuckles and Scary Pockets, bands like that. And I just love how those bands are able to create this like fresh modern sound that is, I don't know, it's hard to categorize if it's jazz or if it's something different. And so Idols was inspired by that, and it's a kind of music that I had never really written in.
You have a song, I think I mentioned to you, that I hear hip-hop in it.
I think you're talking about Nocturnal Interlude. And it's funny you mentioned hip-hop because during the session, we were all talking about, this is straight up Portishead, or they were like citing all these 90s bands that yeah, I guess it is, but that was the only piece that was like composed in the moment. I had a scratch track for that as well, but the way that happened, my friend Leah, who sings with Rising Appalachia, she had mentioned, I'm in town, I'd love to record something if you need any vocals on your record. So I brought Leah in, and she had never heard it. And we basically just came up with the arrangement on the fly, and it became the hip-hop thing by accident.
Oh, what do you mean? It was improvisational in that way?
Yeah, I would say so.
And I keep trying to circle in to get a sense of what you're wanting to say in this music. Mention another song that you can pinpoint to a part of your life that is expressed there.
Sure. Like the track Chikondi was inspired by the year I lived in Malawi. The track Forró do William was inspired by the 2 years I lived in Brazil.
When you say that track was inspired by the year you spent in Malawi, what about that? What are you looking to imbue in the song that you recall in your visceral memory of your time there?
That track, Chikondi, specifically features Peter Mwanga, who is the reason that I lived in Malawi. I made an album with him, and he's featured on the album playing thumb piano and Malawian percussion and singing. And so I always wrote that track with him in mind. But I also, when I wrote it, I was thinking, because I wanted him to play the thumb piano, which, by the way, is called a sansi in Malawi. Because I wanted sansi on that track, I wrote something that was going to work for that instrument, something that's not super chromatic and modulates, but would work with that little instrument. And a melody which reminded me of Malawi. I mean, it's in 6/8, and I remember a lot of music in 6 when I lived in Malawi. But then it's also an Irish jig, which is again, getting to the whole melding of different influences.
Yeah. Do you think that it's fair to characterize this record as sort of a sketchbook of your travels and experiences?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, because that's how I think of it. Each track reminds me of a different place I've lived or a specific musician that I've worked with. And that's the reason I made the album.
Yeah. Let me ask, how are you affording to do this? Because your travel is pretty extensive, and you're recording at Echo Mountain. I don't think you're given a big budget recording contract, or correct me if I'm wrong on that, to make the record. How are you funding all this?
All of it, the travels, the recording session at Echo Mountain, it's all been funded through grants over my life.
That's amazing. You mean like nonprofit foundation grants?
Sometimes. Yeah, let me think here. I guess they would all be considered, nonprofit.
Okay, I ask because I think it's important as other artists listen to interviews like this, that it helps open avenues of thought for them and what's possible.
Since we're talking about it, the grant which I got to fund this project was the North Carolina Arts Council Fellowship. It happened in 2019, but because of the pandemic, I was meant to record this album in May 2020. And so now you know why it was rescheduled 5-6 times.
Are you composing all the time? Are you a pretty prolific songwriter?
I used to be, and then I had a daughter, and life has sort of taken over. I've had a very busy year touring. I haven't had many chances to compose apart from the film work that I've done.
Is there a growth that you can see for yourself as a musician that you made through the making of this music?
Absolutely. Working with these musicians in particular was one of the most inspiring experiences I've ever had. And it taught me a lot about creativity and being a musician, because these musicians were just so creative in the moment. They added so much. The best musicians I've ever worked with, honestly. And so that in itself, I'd never had an experience quite like that. And I've worked with a lot of musicians who I would put at their level. But something about that session, there was just so much energy, so much excitement, so much creative energy specifically in the room. It left me thinking about my music in a whole new way. So I've approached composition differently.
What parts of the world are we going to hear next? Or where are you going to travel next that's going to be represented in your music?
Oh, I probably have to cut myself off, Matt. I probably have enough genres to deal with here. But yeah, strong melodies. And in the same way jazz uses strong melodies as a template for improvisation, I think that will continue from here on out. I'm a melody player. That's how I think as a fiddle player. But developing those melodies and morphing them and transforming them, that is a new way of thinking for me. I've always improvised in tunes, but I've never thought of a tune as a template. When I say tune, I mean a fiddle tune, as a template for improvisation, the same way a jazz player would. And there's lots of kinds of fiddle music with improvisation, but not all of them approach it like a jazz musician would. And because these musicians have a jazz background, we're all able to approach this music that way. And before I know it, these tunes are going off in so many different cool directions I never thought they could.
Yeah, and I imagine you're thinking you're going to embrace that in your projects going forward, kind of that melding of the charted and the improvised.
In fact, I'm already writing for the sequel, I suppose you could say, and thinking of it in the same way.
Remember, Palimpsest celebrates the upcoming 5th season of their show with a performance October 26th at the Black Mountain Center for the Arts. Andrew Finn Magill launches his album, The Polaris Project, with an October 27th concert at the Wortham Center for the Performing Arts in Asheville. I want to thank Jamieson Ridenhour and Andrew Finn Magill for today's conversations. Our First Look newsletter gives you just a handful of daily headlines from around the local media landscape to get you on your morning. We also have a weekly newsletter devoted to all things the Overlook that hits you every Friday. Both are free and available at podavl.com/newsletter. And please support the show by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/theoverlookpodcast. As with most of my interviews, today's conversation happened inside the BB Theater, whose owners, Susan and Giles Collard, have been so gracious enough to allow me to use as my second broadcast studio. The Overlook is a production of Podcast Asheville. New episodes of The Overlook come out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'm Matt Peiken, and I'll see you on the next episode of The Overlook.
Curious how the word y'all has conquered the English-speaking world? Ever wonder why there are so many dollar stores and what they mean to the American landscape? I'm Anissa Khalifa, host of the new podcast, The Broadside, from North Carolina Public Radio. We explore stories at the heart of the American South. Each week, we go beyond the headlines and cover a single topic that impacts our region and explain how it reverberates across the country. Follow The Broadside wherever you get your podcasts.